Welcome to the second session of our conference this morning, Connexions on Global Media in Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. Take a second to introduce myself, Jeff Trimble. For nearly 40 years, I've been involved in international journalism as a correspondent, an editor, and a media manager. I'll be moderating several sessions during the course of the conference. Thanks very much to the conference organizers for including me in what I know is going to be a very stimulating couple of days, and I think we've kicked it off really well with the ambassador. This session is the good, the bad, and the ugly, a historical look at the politics of U.S. information warfare. We'll set some historical context here for our subsequent discussions about how the chaotic media market, to quote the conference materials, informs and impedes the creation, execution, and communication of policy and the effective conduct of diplomacy. And I can't think of two people better qualified to help us understand the rich and checkered history of U.S. information warfare than Matt Armstrong and Nick Cull. Matt, who's joining us today from Spain, I believe, Matt, is an author and lecturer on public diplomacy and international media. He's worked on traditional and emerging security issues with civilian and military and government agencies, news organizations, think tanks, and academia on several continents. He's also made the sausage inside the U.S. government as a governor in the Broadcasting Board of Governors from 2013 to 2017, where I had the privilege of working to support Matt and the board as head of agency for U.S. international broadcasting. And you can follow Matt on mountainrunner.substack.com. And Nicholas Cull, sitting next to me, I can say literally wrote the book on public diplomacy, which I'm holding in my hand right now. Here it is. And of course, many other works as well. Nick is a historian of the role of mass communication in foreign policy and professor at the University of Southern California. Nick has provided advice and training in public diplomacy to foreign ministries and cultural agencies globally. I didn't bring the USIA history book to Austin. It was too heavy to carry, that one, but it's also available outside if you'd like to have a look at that. Matt will kick us off drawing on his research about the United States Information Agency and other historic elements of U.S. information efforts, as well as drawing on his own in-government experience that I have described briefly. Then Nick will respond, expand, question, otherwise react as a discussant, and I'll jump in with questions for here and there. So Matt, there's a narrative out there that once upon a time, back in the Cold War, the U.S. got it completely right on public diplomacy and fielded a formidable government apparatus in support of U.S. policies around the world. A well-planned, well-coordinated, well-organized, well-funded whole-of-government interagency effort that was a world beater. And what we need to now do, in fact, according to this line of thinking, is to recreate the United States Information Agency, the USIA, which was abolished in 1999, and in fact create it on steroids, as former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper called for in congressional testimony, and then all will be well. Your take, as I know from your writings and speaking with you, is somewhat different about that history, as is Nick's, I know from reading his work. So over to you to tell us something about the good, the bad, and the ugly history of U.S. information warfare. Matt, over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff. Nick, it's good to see you. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. One comment I would like to add is that in my bio, you missed that I was sanctioned by Russia, which I accept proudly. That was, I guess it was only last year. But one other comment I want to say before I dive into my thing, and that is something that the ambassador had said, and that these activities by Russia are not new. I'd like to point out that in 1964, the chairman of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, a professor at Georgetown, Dr. Lev Dobrinsky, pointed that out in congressional testimony, that the political warfare of Russia at the time was not new. It was something that he could trace back to the 16th century. So I think there's a nice little tie in Ukraine, and this is not new. Technology has changed, but some of the basic means have not. So I'm going to try to go quickly over 4 basic points, and the fourth will be very quick. And the first is, I guess, something of a history lesson here, and that is USIA was never what it was intended to become. And what I mean by that is that the promises to create it, the recommendations to create it, were never fulfilled. The recommendations and it replaced an agency that was far greater, had far greater authorities, far larger, more programs. And when USIA, the U.S. Information Agency, was created, a smaller entity that did not have a seat at the table as was promised, with far less authorities, far less access to the foreign policy creation and departmental policies of both the State Department and other agencies and departments, that simply was not there. One thing I like to point out is that the predecessor to the U.S. Information Agency was the International Information Administration. That thing, which was, I think, what many people imagine U.S. Information Agency actually was 50% of the State Department's personnel and 40% of its budget. Now, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, liked this, and he was supporting this. His successor, John Foster Dulles, didn't like an operational role for the department and wanted it moved out. So you had these committees saying, these various bodies saying, let's go and create this thing, but it has to have these authorities, and those authorities never, ever materialized. It was an unkept promise that put this agency out on the side. So I'm left to wonder, in all these calls to recreate USIA, when is the heyday? So, for example, in 1959, Senator Munt, formerly Congressman Munt, people will know him from the Smith-Munt Act. He wrote a paper, published an article in the in the Public Relations Journal, calling for Department of International Public Relations for a government agency that is in charge of U.S. government's international information policies. Same year, Brookings Institute issued a report saying, Department of Foreign Affairs, we need this meta agency with 3 cabinet level officials, including a Department of Information and Cultural Affairs. 2 years later, there's a Kennedy task force on USI. Make it whole again, reintegrate the things that Senator Fulbright didn't allow to go to the U.S. Information Agency when it was established in 1953. And another committee, and there were actually 3 bodies at that time saying similar things, one of which was from USI itself, saying, yeah, USI needs to influence, not just inform. But they all said the agency needed an increased role in policy making and a seat at the table. And this continued. So I'm wondering, when is the heyday of these actors, of the proponents for a new U.S. information agency? If we fast forward to the 1980s, which is a time of the Cold War that was very unlike today and very unlike the 50s and 60s and late 40s that is very much like today. And if we go to the 1980s, now we have the Active Measures Working Group, which again, the creation of which suggests that U.S. Information Agency did not have the role that some people think it did. And when U.S. Information Agency took over the lead of Active Measures Working Group in 1987, it did so with an office of 2 people, one of which I think some people in here, certainly Nick, is familiar with, and Jeff, you are, Todd Leventhal, who's still around. Maybe the other guy is too. I don't know him. But this raises the question of, okay, what is this U.S. Information Agency that people are thinking of? The problem is that we don't know our history. We have been in this position before. We have tried to do this, but leadership matters. That's my 4th point, but let me go to a 3rd, and that is the Smith-Munt Act. The Smith-Munt Act was fundamentally about the issues that the ambassador just spoke about, the freedom of information, the free flow of information. It was originally instituted or originally introduced in January 1945 by Congressman Carl Munt to exchange high school and primary school teachers to create greater understanding. As Russian political warfare and disinformation activities picked up, support for the act broadened. And so we have this bill that was fundamentally about countering disinformation, correcting misinformation, and filling in the gaps in the lack of information. Sounds like something that's seemingly a fit for today, except we had a senator who didn't like a government having a voice in the defense of its policy or in creating sunlight. So what's interesting is that what we think of as this firewall, and so I'm preempting, I know some of the conversation is going to go here. What we think is this quote firewall was originally in 1947 introduced as a paperwork reduction policy, if you will. You were supposed to request materials from the State Department's international information programs. Why? Because Congress and the State Department said, we're going to get blanket requests and State Department's going to need more money for more translators to provide all of this. So you just need to ask for it. In 1953, there was an observation that this is a problem and we need to eliminate this domestic limit, and the information needs to be more publicly aware domestically. That was a recommendation from the Advisory Commission. In 1967, it did that again. In 1966, it did that again. And in 67, you have Senator Fulbright talking about Radio Free Europe and how he thinks that this is a really bad thing and equating it to Voice of America and equating it to broader USIA stuff, which ultimately is about Fulbright, who didn't believe communism in Russia was a threat to the United States, to silence the US government because he didn't believe in these information activities. And so that is a somewhat deep dive to get into the point that today we are handicapped because of the disinformation and misinformation about our own legislation that was intended to counter the disinformation and correct the misinformation that we are facing today, both domestically and abroad and in relation to our national security. So how does this matter? What's the imperative? The imperative is that our leadership is confused. The advice that they are receiving is confused. It's not an important thing. We've segregated the informational element from our policies for many decades. Really, I would argue since 1953, when the U.S. Information Agency was created, we've had the strong segregation. So in 1999, when USIA was abolished and we created the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, there was not an appreciation of what that job should do and could do. So today, as of today, there has not been a confirmed undersecretary 45%, almost 46% of the time since the first confirmation in October 1999. In other terms, that 37% of the Bush administration, 22% of the Obama administration, 93% of the Trump administration, and 100% of the Biden administration. Another framework of thinking about this is that if there is a leader in position for only about 19 months, and that is up to the end of the Obama administration, since the Trump and Biden administration really skews things, how is an organization effective when there's only a leader in place for 19 months, with a median gap between persons 7.5 months? So now you have this gross dysfunction that suggests leadership doesn't appreciate the importance of this role. And it delves into an issue of, government communications, again, a point that the ambassador was just speaking about. It reveals that there is not confidence in who can do what. There is not a delegation. There is not a backstopping. There is not a streamlining. There is no tolerance for mistakes. And we're restricted on this freedom of information. We don't believe in it by our practice, by our government practice. So it makes me really highlight the comment that the ambassador made, that what would you do if you're not afraid? Well, that would be a great position to be in, because we're terribly afraid. And we think of Smith-Mundt. Smith-Mundt comes up all the time. Even with the Defense Department, when the 2013 Modernization Act explicitly stated this does not apply to the Defense Department, we still see this flying all over the place. So we don't know what we're doing. We don't know why, and we don't have the leadership or the support to engage in this conversation to really delve into the issues at hand and find a path forward to defeat censorship, both the implicit and the structural. So those are my brief comments.
Matt, thank you very much. Nick, over to you. Some thoughts, reaction, comments?
Well, first of all, it's great to see Matt, and I'm really pleased to be here and looking forward to the discussion over the next few days. My reactions will be in the form of 7 lessons that I draw from the history of public diplomacy. But if you are hoping for a sort of a smackdown, lucha libre kind of confrontation between me and Matt, you're not going to get it, because boringly enough, we're on exactly the same page and have exactly the same conclusions. And all that I would add is that where I see USIA succeeding, where I see the US succeeding in the past, it was through remarkable individuals who for brief moments were fully empowered by leadership. And I think the achievement of Voice of America, and Mark's right here has written an amazing book about that, and was part of the story. That's a testament to what can be done when leaders and remarkable creative people get together to make a difference in the world. And to me, the missing dimension is leadership. And when I look at the history of USIA, the great moments are moments when a leader said, "Go and do it," and people were able to work together. So there are moments in the Eisenhower administration, in the Kennedy administration, and I think particularly in more recent times, the first Gulf War, when there was informed policy or opinion-informed policy, and public diplomacy had a seat at the policy table, where you can really see a difference in what the United States is able to do. So I have some sort of general lessons, and one big conceptual comment. Public diplomacy has to begin with listening. USIA did well when it was listening to the world. And I think that investment in listening, it has to be the foundation to everything that we do in this field. Public diplomacy has to be connected to policy, and it's a big mistake to assume that we can message without being open to change ourselves. And I'll come back to that in a moment. I think it's important to understand that public diplomacy is not a performance for domestic consumption. And by that, what I mean is that because of the way in which politics works in the world right now, I think all countries find that they're a temptation to conduct public diplomacy as a way of pleasing their domestic audiences. And, it's hard enough to conduct foreign policy by engaging a foreign public without winning an election at home. I think if public diplomacy is going to be effective, it requires credibility. And so everything we think about, how do we manage the elements of public diplomacy, including international broadcasting and including culture, should come back to a discussion of credibility. Now, credibility in cultural work overseas and credibility in international broadcasting come from two completely different places. A credible broadcaster is giving objectively accurate news information that checks out and meets professional standards. Credibility in cultural diplomacy is about accurately reflecting the artistic temperament of your country and what people are singing and eating and thinking in your country. And that requires a completely different set of relationships, and I would argue a firewalled and distinct bureaucracy. And to be honest, I don't think that the US government or any government is particularly helpful to either of those sets of credibilities, which is exactly why if you go to Britain or Germany or France, you see that the government keeps its hands off those kinds of activities. And it's so frustrating to see during the Trump years how once again a US government attempt to manage the international broadcasting got in the way of objectivity, and that American international broadcasters had to fight the wrong kind of oversight. And I wish that was just a one-party problem, but both parties have interfered over the years with this aspect, this credibility aspect of public diplomacy. My fifth lesson is that sometimes the most credible voice is not your own. And this has been a hard one for the United States to absorb, because it's used to being the indispensable voice in the world. I think it also, American diplomats want to be seen to be successful for their own professional success. But one of the lessons that came out of the counter-terrorist, counter-radicalization public diplomacy of the last decade and a half was that public diplomacy sometimes works best if it is focused on empowerment and focused on collaboration, rather than thinking, what can I say to win this argument, which is the old way of thinking about public diplomacy. Today, we need to think, who can I empower to win this argument, or who can I empower who will be credible to my audience? Because the truth about the world today is that thanks to social media, we can connect to people exactly like ourselves. And if credibility psychologically is so often based on similarity, international communicators have a problem, because necessarily we are not like the people we're trying to communicate with. The public diplomacy of empowerment seems to me to be the way to go forward. And the Voice of America's language services are absolutely tools of empowerment, where amazing people from the countries we're trying to connect to and communicate with have a role speaking to those places, are empowered. Radio Free Europe worked on exactly that surrogate principle. My sixth lesson is, again, one that goes to maybe against some of the American assumptions about public diplomacy. If public diplomacy had a T-shirt, I think it should say, "Public diplomacy is not all. It's not all about you," and it's been a real problem in recent years, the last 30 years, that public diplomacy has been framed in terms of soft power. I think soft power turns the whole issue of global engagement into a kind of beauty contest / battle royale of the most attractive. That isn't how you want to run communications in international relationships. Relationships require, relating. And the idea that the job of public diplomacy is to assert the country and its unilateral interests is very, very, it's very counterproductive and very limiting. And I can see why public diplomacy is sold on Capitol Hill that way. And professionals, practitioners, don't talk that way to one another, but are forced into this kind of what would you say, forced into a kind of, I guess, a ingenuous narrative just to get funding. The desire to win your relationships is actually a symptom of psychosis. So it's really bizarre that's the way we have to present public diplomacy. The final thing I'd say is that public diplomacy is everyone's business. And part of the problem with USIA is the idea that you can set up a kind of agency, especially when the agency is crippled in fundamental ways. But the idea is that there's an agency whose job it is to take care of that public opinion thing. The public need to care about this. They need to be part of the solutions. And one of the issues that I know Vivian Walker, who we'll be hearing from later on in the conference, has put a lot of emphasis on, is that there's a domestic dimension to public diplomacy, which includes, I think, as a priority now, the involvement of diasporas. So my summing up is that, if soft power isn't the frame going forward, if we're not thinking about reviving USIA in a crude way, what is the frame? What should we be thinking of? And the way I think about it is by talking about public diplomacy as an aspect of what I call reputational security. And that means accepting that public diplomacy is not a kind of optional extra of foreign policy, but rather it's part of the core business of the state. And the point of that insight is that public diplomacy isn't about doing or talking about some more things, about adding things to your communication, but it's also about subtracting things from the reality of life in your country. And you may say to me, but Nick, when has that ever been part of American foreign policy? And I have to say, at the most important moments of American outreach, public diplomacy included domestic policy changes, and that's been the case for other countries too. So the two cases I'll talk about right now, Eisenhower and Kennedy's response to Soviet propaganda was not merely to say that the United States is wonderful. It was not just to send a Buckminster Fuller dome full of amazing American objects to Moscow. It was also to look hard at American society and say, the Russians say we're racist, we have to be less racist. We have to deliver on a reality of political change, civil rights change in this country. And if you read the documents in the Eisenhower and Kennedy libraries around civil rights, you will see civil rights change had a Cold War imperative. Flash forward to Lyndon Johnson. Johnson didn't just invest in public diplomacy to tell the world about the United States and its, in Johnson's case, its war in Vietnam. He also realized that if the US was going to prevail in the world, he had to change the realities of American immigration policy and make it less discriminatory and more inclusive. So those are important moments in public diplomacy, but they're also moments in domestic policy. And so I think that looking at ourselves and saying sometimes in a moment of informational challenge, it's important to say, how do we become less the stereotype of our adversary? How do we come, if we're accused of corruption, we should be less corrupt. When we're accused of racism, we should be less racist. And when our society is viewed externally as so riven with violence that people don't want to take up exchange places at American colleges because they're too worried about being shot, that should be move those issues further up our agenda. If a state is not delivering on an aspect of its security, a contract has been broken. That's part of what we ask the state to do, is to keep our world secure. If reputation is part of security, if public diplomacy is part of our security, and the state is failing in the way that Matt was setting up by not even appointing somebody to run the thing 50% of the, or 46% of the time, we have a problem, and we should be demanding better leadership from both sides of the aisle. And my final thought is that security can be collective, and reputational security can be collective. And part of what is so important about the story of Ukraine is that we see all of our interests being defended by Ukraine. And I think that now it's a time to invest in every democracy doing a better job to communicate with the world, and every democracy finding a way to be its best self, to reduce the vulnerabilities to external disruptive and manipulative media. So probably that's probably enough to be going on with. But thanks, Jeff, for bringing me here.
And Matt, thank you. Yeah. Andres, hang on one sec. I'm tempted to immediately come back on the issue of reputational security and ask whether or not in the contemporary political social environment in the United States we can even have an honest discussion about reputational security given trends in society here as opposed to what happened there. I think I won't ask you that right now, and that includes things going on right here in the great state of Texas and in Missouri where I live and other states around the United States. But let me go back to the root thing for just a second, and Andres, I'll get to you in just a second. I'm really glad to see questions coming up already. Let's make this interactive very quickly. Nick, you write that the U.S. is at its heart a skeptical participant in public diplomacy. You touched on that, and you say, and the development of the practice was contingent on the anomalous politics of the Cold War. You touched on this in your remarks. Could I draw you out on that a bit more?
Well, I have to be careful how I respond here because I know it's something that Matt has. Matt will pull me up if I mess any of the details.
And Matt, I'm coming to you next on the same question.
To me, the assumption of the United States is that the private sector is the right entity to communicate, and that the government voice in international affairs is something you need when there is a crisis. So sure, there's a heritage of the United States communicating in times of crises, but there's also a heritage of the United States backing away from communication. And I think there's a kind of a hokey pokey of American public diplomacy where they're putting their whole selves in and then pulling the whole self out just a few years later because Congress isn't comfortable with all of that communication being done by the nation state. So the moment at the end of World War II, when the U.S. government decides, well, maybe they should keep, or some people within the U.S. government are prepared to fight to keep communication tools set up during the war, that's really unusual because in most cases, the U.S. government backs away, and we saw that backing away process repeated at the end of the Cold War when USIA became a victim of its own success and was able to say, "Hey, they were always saying you need us to win the Cold War," and then when the Cold War came to an end, they talked themselves out of a job. So I certainly see that dynamic.
Matt, let me draw you out on the same. Let me draw you out on the same issue, Matt, but set that up with a quote from something you wrote in 2015 in War on the Rocks. You wrote, "There is a stunning lack of strategic vision in America today. The range of foreign policy activities beyond so-called traditional diplomacy extend across military power and include everything from financial aid to information to exchanges of all kinds. The instruments are, however, seemingly applied without synchronization or thoughts about end states. The different bureaucracies work together only on an ad hoc basis and rarely share collaborative requirements and communications, even with their respective oversight committees in Congress." Matt, over to you.
Yeah. So the issue is that point of coordination, right? Is the point of collaboration, integration, and this is an issue that I spoke about, talking about the U.S. Information Agency, also what Nick was just speaking about. And one thing I'd like to highlight is that Nick is right. At the end of World War II, actually before the end of World War II, the State Department in January 45 was like, hey, do we need these information activities? And they determined that, yes, modern international relations take place between people, not just governments. And so the decision was this stuff is necessary. But directly in line with what Nick said, is that the government was to have a supplemental and facilitatory role, not the lead role. And the idea was the private sector should be out there speaking, and the government would fill in the gaps. The government would just be, here's the entirety of the president's speech and that type of stuff. And so just as Nick was saying, this was the intent, was that there was this private-public partnership. The government would be helping the private commercial news media to get abroad. So this transforms over the years because, especially over these last few decades, the depth of the conversations around these subjects, they're just shallow. There's no depth. So if we look back into the late 40s, the 50s, and you look at just the length of the hearings and the depth of the conversations on the Hill, for example, they're quite expansive. And the public side of this conversation was quite expansive. And so today, from decades of segregating the informational element of policy, from the lack of leadership and the lack of a demand signal from the White House on down, and the White House, including the National Security Council, to comprehensively approach these issues, which is something that Eisenhower complained about as a presidential candidate, that there's a lack of coherency in our policy. This is an old issue. So I would say that it has to do with more than Congress reacting, but also how the executive goes to the Hill, but also the competition over budgets. And the fact that this stuff is cheap still gets lost in the conversation, because all this stuff is amazingly cheap. And one thing I comment on the victim of U.S. Information Agency being a victim of its success. Yeah, that's because the narrative over why we did this stuff was absolutely strapped to the Cold War, when this stuff created, because modern international relations happens between people, not just governments, but we lost that. So Jeff, to your point, I think because we lost that larger picture, that there is an informational element to everything we say and do at home and abroad, to paraphrase Eisenhower, again, harking back to Nick's earlier comments about civil rights. Everything we say and do has an effect abroad, just like all of our policies have effects. But we fail to coordinate that. Congress fails to exercise its oversight in this. When I was a governor on the Broadcasting Board of Governors, now the U.S. Agency for Global Media, I would meet with congressional oversight, and I would say about half the members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee were surprised that Voice of America was still operational. Mm-hmm. So there is an interesting lack of oversight taking place there. So where are these conversations? It's not positive. So I'm going to stop there, because I can just keep going negative and going into the hole.
We have 3 questions lined up already, and I'll get back in if I can. Let's start. And I'd like to ask colleagues, questioners, please introduce yourself and give an affiliation so that our speakers can know who you all are.
Hi, I'm Andres Ilves, and I'm back with RFERL, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. This is my 3rd time. When I first started, Konstantin Chernenko was the General Secretary of the CPSU. So, and in between, I spent 11 years at the BBC. And despite being Estonian, my specialty is Iran and Afghanistan. And my question is about the differing missions and your thoughts on the fact that if we take the very names of a lot of international broadcasters, Voice of America, British Broadcasting Corporation, and so on, not just their names, but their missions actually involve a projection of the country's values and somewhat of a focus, not entirely, but a focus on what's going on in that country. If you take RFERL in its very name, you have concepts of freedom and liberty, and who else is actually broadcasting to a place where the name is not of the country itself, but of its target audience, Radio Free Europe. And I find that the missions of international broadcasting entities are evolving to such an extent that in my perception, they're evolving more in the direction of the latter. That is to say, insofar as we're no longer broadcasting as much via radio, we're facilitating conversations that are happening in the target countries. So we have Facebook pages. I have nothing left to say as a speaker tomorrow because I'm saying it now. But basically, the missions are different. The missions are changing. And I'm just curious, in the very short time that we have left, if any of you could comment on how those differing missions, especially because the U.S. has had these two broadcasting entities at the same time with different missions, and how those serve public diplomacy, and also how those missions are evolving as we head more into a social media and engagement with our target audiences than we once did.
Matt, as you served as a governor on the Broadcasting Board of Governors, I think I'll give you first crack at that, but Nick's nodding his head as well, so I think we'll hear from him as well. Matt, would you like to respond to Andres's question?
Yeah. So Andres, thanks for your service there. The first, I would say that the names, set aside the names for a bit, because those names, Voice of America got its name officially in 1946. Its name was not official in 45, whatever. And then, of course, the intelligence agency created Radio Free Europe, and then later Radio Liberty, and then later Radio Free Asia, which was closed shortly after, before being recreated after Tiananmen Square. But in the modern era, which is really what your question is about, I set aside the actual names, and the function of all of them is, in my opinion, and as I argued when I was on the board, they're all surrogates, because the basic operation of these entities is to provide news and information to audiences that are subject to censorship, either structural or implicit. So audiences that have a limited ability to access, or no ability, challenged ability to access truthful news and information. So where the missions differ, Radio Free, RFERL, just like RFA, is very highly focused on the local politics and the local environment. VOA is going to be focused more on the global issues, maybe also regional issues, and also here is the United States and some news that's relevant about the United States to that audience. And that's very important. You know this extremely well. I think many people, and I know people that were close to leadership in BBG, were not aware, and I know members of Congress and pundits aren't aware, but there is a very distinct difference in how these operations treat different language audiences, because those audiences have different needs. RFERL is very specific on that. And it will engage its Ukrainian audience in a very different way than it's going to engage its Belarus audience, because they have different needs and requirements, and even through different mediums. So I would say that for the most part, the missions don't really, there's minimal, if any, overlap. They fundamentally have a different relationship with their audience. They function differently, and they generally have a different basket of news and information and a way they will convey that news and information to the audience. Now, I will caveat that with that's dated, because I haven't been involved for a while, but conceptually, I would still say that is 100% what it should be and what it should remain to be. And so we have to look at it in a certain way. But I want to emphasize one other point. I have argued, and I had a debate with RFERL staff extensively when I was in Prague, that VOA is a surrogate as well. Not just RFERL, because it's operating because of a lack of local media and is providing that local news and information. I would also argue that if we do a traditional definition of public diplomacy, these broadcasters, these operations are not public diplomacy, because public diplomacy is about a relationship between you and me. These broadcast operations are about the audience, and it's about empowering that audience and what they need to know, which may or may not have anything to do with me. So that's a challenge. And I think that is a fundamental reality of the difference between how our broadcasters work. Also, the other thing I would like to say is that the fundamental purpose of our broadcasters is to go out of business. In other words, to be unnecessary, because your goal is to empower the local audiences as well as empower local media. You do that through your various tools and your methodologies and your training. You don't fundamentally want to be necessary. You want to empower a press freedom and a capacity for press freedom and an operational free press in those countries so that you're not necessary, which I think is another very distinct point that also helps diminish that these things, deny that these are propaganda operations. These are free press operations.
Nick, anything to add to that?
Just that I agree 100%. And to me, part of where the names are valuable is that it shows which countries are so serious about press freedom that they put their name on it. So it's you could even see Voice of America, Deutsche Welle, BBC as being the oldest kind of diplomacy, the gift, and saying that these nation states are prepared to make a gift of free media for the benefit of audiences in unfree places, but that emphasis has to be on what the audience wants and needs, and not on some kind of irrelevant material narrowly promoting the excellence of the country of origin, which was one of the functions that international broadcasting had in its earliest days.
We have with us today here the chief strategist for the U.S. Agency for Global Media, Kate Nieper. And so you'll be able to pose that question to Kate I think you're in 2 panel sessions on Wednesday. So we can follow up on that if it's of particular interest. And it does get very complicated and frankly very messy, I can say from personal experience of a couple of decades of struggling with this issue of missions and roles myself. But good question, good response. Go after Kate on Wednesday on this, okay? Sir, please introduce yourself.
I'm Mark Pomar, and I am a veteran of USIA, a veteran of VOA, and a veteran of RFERL back in the wonderful 1980s. So I feel I have to at least weigh in somewhat on the points being made. Lots of things to disagree with, but I don't think we have the time to go into a lot of details. I do want to agree with what Nick said, that a lot depended at USIA what was the message from the White House. And then, of course, VOA was part of USIA, and we were much bigger than USIA. So that also created its own complications, that we were the big entity of USIA. In many ways, we dominated USIA. Just to give you one small example of our involvement, I recall as the USSR division chief going to the Situation Room in the White House to give a full-length 2-hour presentation to the NSC on what we were broadcasting, how we were broadcasting, whom we were bringing in, the issues we were approaching. That was an empowerment that, we felt we were very much at the center of activity. I mean, I recall sitting in my office and drafting letters from Director Wick to people in the Politburo on information policy that we sat in VOA. We were creating that letter. When it came back to us, we saw very few changes had been made. And so I think when you talk about USIA, and again, I'm talking about the 1980s, when we had a superb budget, we had more money than we really knew how and what to spend it on. I mean, I had more slots to fill than there were people I could find to hire. So I think a lot of that is, as Nick said, very much driven by the policy coming from the White House and the way it works its way down through the bureaucracy.
I think, Mark, thank you. When we come back to issues around U.S. international broadcasting on Wednesday, it will be important to make sure everyone in the conference understands the firewall and the extent to which you're involved in discussions and work with the rest of the U.S. government, and that the journalists are working entirely independently, doing what journalists do. That's a difficult concept for many to grasp, so I just put it out there now as something I'd like to talk about more when we come back to it on Wednesday. Go ahead.
If I can just come back, I think that's an extremely important point. I also, when people talk about VOA and RFERL as news and information, I would say 70% of what we broadcast was culture, history, literature, ideas, just as true at VOA. I mean, we were on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we had tons of time to really get into a lot of cultural issues, both about the United States in the case of VOA, but also about the Soviet Union, different cultures of the Soviet Union. I mean, we were decolonizing the Soviet Union before the term became popular. I mean, we were dealing with very, very specific cultures within the Soviet Union. We had a very vibrant Ukrainian service, excellent Ukrainian service that was broadcasting, again, 24 hours a day. So these are the kinds of issues that I think very important when talking about USA and VOA, is going back to what period are you talking about? You're talking about the 70s, or you're talking about the 80s. They're very different organizations doing very different work.
I think that's one of the important things in your book, is that you make the point about how American international broadcasting became a virtual space in which issues of Russian history could be discussed, which just were not discussable in the Soviet Union at that time. But those issues are thought about and in media space created by the US government. And that's a tremendous part of the story that I think much neglected if we focus only on usually it's jazz and news about headlines about what was happening in the world. It's much more fundamental than that.
And that most people don't know is the extent to which Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty were religious broadcasters. We had hours and hours about religion, religious services, sermons. I mean, this is an area that virtually no one knows, and yet that was critical and important part of our broadcasting.
I'll restrain myself in the interest of time. This is a very, very rich subject that we'll talk about more come Wednesday. Yes, Matt, question, please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Jessica Snyder, and I'm a cyber intelligence analyst with Booz Allen Hamilton, and UT alum. I was wondering, to take things back to the domestic collective idea of public diplomacy, how do we shift, because of the nature of the short election cycle in the US, how do we shift from public diplomacy efforts back to the people within party gridlock? And also, is the central government too strong for the people to have a significant difference at this point? And I know it's a big topic, but if you have any quick thoughts.
Who'd like to take that? Matt, do you want to start with that on that one?
Nick is closer.
Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Jessica. I think that with this, this goes to a major problem. The United States really is divided. It really is a mess, and this should be a problem. And I think that what we need to do is think about what we agree on, because there's a lot of agreement. Bipartisanship is possible. There are people in the Senate on both sides of the aisle who see things in exactly the same way that we do we do here, and I think it's time to draw that out. And I'm very frustrated by the way in which issues of public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, international broadcasting are played for partisan advantage in a very unhelpful way. And this is not just a U.S. problem, but happens in many democratic countries. It's hard to help a person who won't help themselves. It's hard to help a polity that won't help itself. But I think we're now in a situation where there are issues at stake that are civilizational, and it's time to wake up and leave some of our comfortable partisanship and jousting and back and forth behind, and focus on getting the job done. That's my feeling. Matt, do you?
So, yeah, I would frame it. I would say the same thing in a slightly different way. And sometimes the call is coming from inside the house, and you need to deal with that and figure out how to do that. Whether or not government is too big, I don't think that's the question. I think the issue is we need to be more aware of the communication we are creating. We need to anticipate the attacks on the efforts, just as we need to educate, empower, equip, and encourage folks to act in this space. And that also requires allowing the actors to make mistakes and get out there and say stuff.
And to come back on this, it's clear that the U.S. government doesn't expect to have pushback on public diplomacy reform and communication reform. That the Clinton administration was caught out by this rearrangement document called Security Decision 66 in the late 90s. Domestic media has this panic button marked Orwellian, and that they will thump it at the drop of a hat. It is amazing to see how the US government is caught out by this. Most recently, the fiasco around the Disinformation Governance Board, which was just rolled out in a completely amateur way with naivety as to what the likely reaction would be to something with that name and with those particular people involved. This is too serious a job to be treated as amateur hour, and not to expect, not to understand how these kinds of activities can be miscast for selling papers or whatever advantage people are going for. It's really nauseating and frustrating to see these mistakes being made over and over and over again.
Well, then perhaps by way of wrapping up, in our current chaotic information environment, which is at the heart of what we're talking about at this conference, Nick, you also mentioned how it's inseparable what reaches domestic audiences and foreign audiences, that a message to a foreign audience, you use the instance of George Bush and his reference to a crusade and how that's perceived very differently in Kansas from where it might be perceived elsewhere, and that overlapped. How do we work through the digital environment of trying to keep messages distinct, or do we just have to acknowledge and be cognizant of the fact that they are inseparable?
Well, I think you've got two problems. You've got the problem that a message crafted for Kansas is heard in Kandahar, but I see the bigger problem as being speaking to Kandahar because you want it to be heard in Kansas, and we have to look at both of those and make sure that your message, it's now impossible to be different things at home and abroad. And, I often think back to 1968 and those demonstrators in Chicago chanting, "The whole world is watching." Well, the whole world is watching now and listening and can see what's going on and makes its decisions based on what it sees going on in societies. And in many ways, the United States compares well, but there's also things in the United States that are very visible to international audiences that I think represent tremendous vulnerabilities. And however we move forward, there has to be a certain humility. And historically, the world loves humble America much more than the show-off guy. And I point out that Superman would be intolerable were it not for kryptonite. And sometimes by talking about your vulnerabilities, talking about your problems, it's a process you can share with international audiences. And, that America assumes it has to give solutions to the world. Just having an honest discussion in front of the world might be a step forward, and modeling how those kinds of discussions take place in a free country would be, I think, a step forward.
Matt, over to you for a minute or so of any final thoughts.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Nick was saying. I think part of the problem is that we're not a messy and noisy communicator. We're too restrained in our communication. So when something happens, it is sort of like it's happening in a vacuum, and then we don't know how to react to it. So an example I've used for years as along this line of conversation is there was a time during our military involvement in Iraq where a sniper was using a Quran for target practice. The commanding officer had his translator write up the apology in Arabic in the local dialect and issued it. And then it was translated to English. And you probably are unaware of this situation because it never really materialized in the US. We were speaking to a local audience in the local language on a local issue. The point here is that we need to have that comfort to speak locally and to have that confidence that that is a requirement, and that if it is misunderstood domestically, that we can actively correct any misperception and have people understand that there are different audiences, they have a different frame, they have a different historical narrative, they interpret the message in a certain way, and that's how we're communicating. And I think important, and this goes back to another point that Nick made about the credibility, but we have to have policies that we can stand behind. I think too often what we try to forget is that for much of this century, our public diplomacy has been about changing the subject or putting lipstick on a pig. And we need to have a policy that can stand up. In fact, if we go back in the history and we go back to the time of Smith-Munn, we go to the 40s and the 50s, the idea was we needed information policy to make known our actual policies. Not what the Russians are saying they are, but what they actually are. And this goes into that integration piece. Why are we doing it? What effect are we trying to achieve? And do we know that? So that would be my final comments. And I think that might go to Jessica's comment as well. And before I forget, I want to say hi to Kate.
Did everyone take good notes? Because I think that we've just had a lot of grist that will inform discussion questions going forward in these next couple of days. And Nick, I'm really glad that you're hanging around and will be in other panels. And Matt, I hope that we can facilitate if you'd be able to join us or rejoin at certain times, that we're aware you're there and can draw you back into conversations as inevitably questions come back and touch on this complicated past of public diplomacy and how we play it out in the contemporary environment. But for the moment, I'd like very much to thank you both, Matt Armstrong from Europe and Nick Cull here with me, for this really terrific panel. Thank you very much. Now, if I can invite Brian Whitmore. This is a bit of a marathon run here, first thing in the morning, but we're going to do a quick half hour here before we move on into other moderators and panel sessions.